They told her she was crazy. A mail-order bride traveling alone to marry a stranger in the Dakota Territory. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. When Evelyn Hart stepped off that train in 1883, she found no husband waiting, no ranch house standing, only smoke-blackened ruins and silence. But beneath the ashes, 8 pairs of eyes stared up at her from a collapsed cellar, children left to die, forgotten by everyone. In that moment, Evelyn faced a choice that would define not just her life, but the future of an entire frontier community. This is her story. Before we begin, I invite you to stay until the very end, because what starts as one woman's desperate gamble becomes something far greater. And please, drop a comment with your city or country, so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The train lurched to a stop with a metallic shriek that seemed to echo across the emptiness of the Dakota Territory. Evelyn Hart pressed her gloved hand against the frost-covered window, her breath fogging the glass as she peered out at what was supposed to be her new beginning. The platform, if you could even call it that, was nothing more than weathered planks laid across the prairie mud, warped by countless seasons of brutal heat and merciless cold. She was 27 years old, educated, refined, and absolutely terrified. "Last stop, miss," the conductor announced, his voice gruff but not unkind. He'd watched her throughout the 3-day journey, this solitary woman with her worn carpetbag and the slight tremor in her hands whenever the train passed through particularly desolate stretches of wilderness. "You sure someone's meeting you?" Evelyn straightened her spine, a gesture she'd perfected over years of maintaining composure when everything inside her wanted to crumble. "Mr. Thomas Hart is expecting me. We've corresponded for 6 months." The conductor's expression suggested he'd heard similar stories before, and they didn't always end well. "I'll help with your trunk, ma'am." The November wind hit her like a physical blow the moment she stepped down, cutting through her Boston-made coat as if it were tissue paper. This wasn't the crisp autumn chill she'd known back east. This was something alive and hostile, a wind that seemed determined to scour away anything foolish enough to exist on this endless plain. The town of Redemption Crossing consisted of 7 buildings huddled together as if for warmth. A general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a blacksmith's forge, a land office, a boarding house, and a structure whose purpose Evelyn couldn't immediately determine. Mud streets. No sidewalks. Not a tree in sight except for a few stubborn cottonwoods clustered near what might have been a creek. She stood on the platform, her trunk at her feet, scanning the handful of faces for a man she'd know only from a single photograph. A stern-looking rancher with dark hair and serious eyes who'd written to her about building something meaningful in this harsh land. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The few people who'd bothered to notice her arrival had long since gone about their business. The conductor emerged from the station building, concern evident in the way he kept glancing her direction while pretending not to. "Miss Hart?" A woman approached, middle-aged and weather-beaten, wrapped in a shawl that had seen better decades. "You're Thomas Hart's intended?" "I am. I'm waiting for—" "You'd better come with me." The woman's tone carried something Evelyn couldn't quite identify. Pity? Fear? "I'm Marjorie Blackwood. I run the boarding house." "I appreciate the offer, but Mr. Hart will be here. Perhaps his wagon broke down, or—" "Child." Marjorie stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Thomas Hart is dead. Has been for near about 2 weeks now." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Her vision narrowed, the edges going dark for just a moment. That's not possible. I received a letter from him just 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks ago he was alive. Then the raiders came through. Marjorie's jaw tightened. "We sent word east, but I guess it didn't reach you in time. I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing." Nothing. The word echoed in Evelyn's mind. She'd sold everything she owned to afford the train ticket. She'd left behind a teaching position that barely paid enough for rent, a boarding house room that smelled of boiled cabbage and desperation, and a marriage proposal from a dry goods merchant who'd made it clear he wanted a housekeeper more than a wife. She'd burned every bridge, cashed in every favor, bet everything on this one chance at something different. "The homestead," Evelyn heard herself say. "Mr. Hart's property." Marjorie's expression grew even more pained. "Burned. The raiders torched it after they—" After.
The land's still there, I suppose, but there's nothing on it worth claiming now. You should take the next train back east. It leaves day after tomorrow." 2 days. Evelyn had exactly $14.37 in her purse. Not nearly enough for a return ticket, let alone food and lodging until she could find work. And even if she could afford it, return to what? She'd already informed her landlady she wouldn't be back, already resigned from the school, already said her goodbyes to the few people who'd mattered. "I'd like to see the homestead," Evelyn said quietly. "Miss Hart, there's nothing to see, but I'd like to see it." Evelyn met the older woman's eyes, and something in her gaze must have communicated that this wasn't a request.
"Could you direct me, or perhaps someone could drive me there?" Marjorie sighed. "It's 5 miles out. Fletcher at the livery might rent you a horse and wagon, but it'll be dark in a few hours, and that road's not safe even in daylight, not with those raiders still running loose." "Then I'll go at first light tomorrow." The boarding house room cost 50 cents a night, a fortune Evelyn couldn't afford, but refusing would mean sleeping in the train station or worse. The room itself was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a window that looked out onto the mud street. But it was warm, and the mattress was stuffed with something that wasn't straw, and right now, that was everything. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her coat, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of her situation. The fear, the regret, the crushing sense that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then she opened her carpet bag, withdrew the bundle of letters Thomas Hart had sent over 6 months, and began to read them again by candlelight. He'd written about his dream of building something lasting, a ranch that could sustain not just himself, but a family, maybe even grow into something that could help others stake their own claims. He'd been honest about the hardships, the isolation, the brutal climate, the constant work, but there'd been hope in those letters, a sense of possibility that had resonated with Evelyn's own desperate hunger for a life that meant something. "I won't pretend it's easy out here," he'd written in his 4th letter, "but there's a freedom in building something from nothing. Back east, everything's already been decided. Who you'll be, what you'll do, how much space you're allowed to take up in the world. Out here, those rules don't apply. A person can become whoever they're brave enough to be, brave enough." Evelyn folded the letters carefully and returned them to her bag. She'd traveled 1,500 miles based on words from a stranger. Surely she could manage 5 more miles to see what remained of his dream. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the sounds of the frontier night, shouts from the saloon, the clatter of horse hooves, wind that made the building creak and groan like a ship at sea. Dawn arrived with a harsh beauty that took Evelyn's breath away. The sun rose over the prairie in shades of gold and amber, illuminating an ocean of grass that stretched endlessly in every direction. It was terrible and magnificent at once. All that space, all that emptiness, all that possibility and danger mixed together until you couldn't tell them apart. Fletcher, the livery owner, was a taciturn man who clearly thought Evelyn was making a mistake, but was willing to take her money anyway. $1 for the wagon and horse for the day. You break something, you buy it. You get killed by raiders, I still expect payment from your estate. Cheerful fellow, Evelyn muttered as she climbed onto the wagon seat. Road follows the creek north, Fletcher said, handing her the reins. Hart's place is about an hour out. You'll see the burned timber soon enough. And miss, take this. He pressed something into her hand, a small pistol. You probably don't know how to use it, but having it visible might make someone think twice. Evelyn had never held a gun before. The weight of it was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. Thank you. The road was barely worthy of the name, just ruts worn by wagon wheels through the grass. The horse, a patient mare with kind eyes, seemed to know the way and needed little guidance. Evelyn clutched the reins and tried not to think about Fletcher's casual mention of raiders, or the fact that she was traveling alone through hostile territory to visit a burned-out homestead where a man had been murdered. The prairie, up close, was far more alive than it appeared from a distance. Birds she couldn't name darted through the grass. Small mammals, prairie dogs Fletcher had called them, stood on their hind legs near burrow entrances, watching her pass with alert curiosity. The grass itself whispered and sang in the wind, creating a sound like the ocean, if oceans were made of gold instead of blue. She saw the smoke damage first, a dark smudge against the horizon,
like someone had taken charcoal and marked the land. As the wagon drew closer, the devastation became clear. The main house had been substantial once, probably 30 by 40 feet, built from logs chinked with mud. Now it was just blackened timber and collapsed roof beams, still radiating a faint smell of char despite 2 weeks of weather. Evelyn brought the wagon to a stop and sat for a long moment, taking it in. The barn had burned too, though portions of its stone foundation remained. A chicken coop, miraculously spared, listed to one side. A well stood intact, its wooden cover askew. This was where Thomas Hart had poured his hope and labor. This was the life he'd invited her to share. And now it was ash. She climbed down from the wagon, her boots sinking slightly in the soft earth. The November wind felt colder here, more bitter, as if the land itself was grieving. She walked slowly toward the ruins, picking her way carefully, not sure what she was even looking for. Evidence that his dreams had been real? Some sign that this disaster could somehow be transformed into an opportunity? That's when she heard it. A sound so faint she almost dismissed it as wind or imagination. A child's voice. Crying. Evelyn froze, her heart hammering. She turned slowly, scanning the homestead, trying to pinpoint the source. There, near what had been the eastern corner of the house. The ground there looked disturbed, as if something had collapsed inward. She moved closer, calling out, "Hello! Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by terrified silence. "I'm not going to hurt you," Evelyn said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "My name is Evelyn. Are you hurt?" Silence. Then, barely audible, "Go away." A boy's voice. Young, but trying to sound older, braver. Evelyn knelt at the edge of what she now realized was a collapsed root cellar. The wooden doors had been blown off in the fire, and debris had partially filled the entrance. But there was a gap, perhaps 2 feet wide, leading down into darkness. "I can't go away," Evelyn said gently. "Not until I know you're all right. How many of you are down there?" More silence. Then, "Are you a raider?" "No, I was supposed to marry Mr. Hart, but he's gone now, and I came to see the homestead." "He's dead." The boy's voice cracked slightly. "They killed him. They killed Mama, too." Evelyn's breath caught. Children. Thomas Hart had never mentioned children in his letters. Had he planned to? Had he worried that a mail-order bride might reject the idea of instant motherhood? "I know they did," Evelyn said softly. "And I'm so sorry. But you can't stay down there. When did you last eat?" No answer. "I have food in my wagon, bread and cheese. Not much, but it's something. Will you let me help you?" "You'll take us to the county," the boy said flatly. "They'll split us up. Put us in different houses. I won't let them take Gracie and the twins. I won't. County homes." Evelyn had seen them back east, overcrowded orphanages where children were treated as labor more than people, where siblings were separated based on age and gender, where the lucky ones might be adopted out to families who needed extra hands, and the unlucky ones simply aged out with no skills and no prospects. "Let me see all of you first," Evelyn said. "Then we'll figure out what happens next, please." A long pause. Then she heard scraping sounds, whispered consultation. Finally, a face appeared in the gap. A boy, perhaps 14, painfully thin, with haunted eyes and hair that might have been brown under the dirt. He held a knife in one hand, its blade dull, but his grip steady. "Don't come closer," he warned. "I won't." Evelyn stayed where she was, letting him assess her. "What's your name?" "Miles. Miles Hart." Hart, Thomas's son, which meant these were Thomas's children. Evelyn felt the world tilt slightly, pieces clicking into place. Thomas had been a widower with children. How many, she still didn't know. He'd been building this homestead for them, trying to create stability after loss. And now they were alone. "How many of you, Miles?" His jaw tightened. 8. 8 children, orphaned, hiding in a collapsed cellar. How long had they been down there? Days? A week? 2 weeks since the murders, meaning they'd been surviving in the dark, with whatever food and water they'd managed to save, waiting for what? Rescue that never came?
For the raiders to return and finish the job? I'm coming back, Evelyn said. Right now, with food and water. Don't run, Miles, please. You're Thomas Hart's children, which means... She stopped, the words catching in her throat as the full implications hit her. Which means you're the reason I'm here. She ran back to the wagon, grabbed her small supply of provisions, bread, hard cheese, 3 apples, a canteen of water, and returned to the cellar entrance. Miles was still there, knife ready, watching her with the wariness of a wild animal. I'm going to set these down and back away, Evelyn said. You can take them, share them with the others. I'll wait by the wagon while you talk. But Miles, I need you to understand something. It's November. Winter is coming. You can't survive in that cellar once the real cold hits. You need help. And She took a breath. I came here to build a life with your father. He's gone. But his children aren't, so maybe we help each other. She set down the food and water, backed away as promised, and walked to the wagon on shaking legs. Only when she was out of earshot did she allow herself to lean against the wagon wheel, gripping it hard as the full weight of what she'd just committed to crashed over her. 8 children. 8. She had $14 to her name, no home, no job, and winter approaching fast. She was proposing to take responsibility for 8 orphaned children on a burned-out homestead in the middle of hostile territory where raiders still roamed free. It was insane, impossible, beyond reckless. And yet, as Evelyn watched Miles emerge from the cellar with the food, followed by a parade of smaller faces, a girl about 12 clutching twin toddlers, another girl maybe 10 years old, a boy around 8, and 3 more ranging from 5 to 7, she felt something shift inside her chest. These children were alive against all odds. They'd survived murder, fire, starvation, and abandonment. They'd held together as a family when everything and everyone else had failed them. If they could survive that, what couldn't they survive? What couldn't she survive? The children devoured the food with desperate efficiency, sharing it with a precision that spoke to weeks of careful rationing. The oldest girl, she had Thomas's dark hair and his serious eyes, broke the bread into exact portions. The boy Miles gave his apple to the twins. Every movement was coordinated, practiced, a survival dance they'd perfected in the dark. When the food was gone, they stood in a ragged line, staring at Evelyn, waiting for her to make a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. Evelyn walked slowly toward them, watching as Miles tensed, his hand moving toward that knife again. She stopped 10 feet away, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to hopefully seem non-threatening. My name is Evelyn Hart, she said formally, as if making introductions at a church social instead of in the ruins of a burned homestead. I was coming to marry your father. I didn't know about you. He never mentioned children in his letters, though I suppose he had his reasons. But I'm here now, and you're here, and I think we should help each other. Help how? The older girl spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse from disuse or crying, or both. You can't take care of all of us. Nobody can. You're right, I can't. But maybe we can take care of each other. Evelyn gestured at the ruins. Your father filed a homestead claim, yes? 160 acres? Miles nodded slowly. Under the Homestead Act, that claim can be inherited by family or transferred to a surviving spouse. I was coming here as your father's wife. Legally, that makes me, complicated. But it also means I might be able to claim this land, to build on it, to make it work. With what? Miles's laugh was bitter. We've got nothing. House burned, barn burned, livestock ran off or killed. Winter's coming, and we've been eating roots and whatever Lila can snare. You think you can fix this with pretty words and good intentions? No, Evelyn said flatly. I think we can fix this with work. Brutal, endless, backbreaking work. I think we can turn that root cellar into winter shelter while we rebuild. I think we can file claims on every resource this land offers and defend it with everything we have. Will it be hard? Yes. Will we probably fail? Maybe. Will it be better than splitting you all up or trying to survive another week in that cellar? She let the question hang in the cold air. The oldest girl, Lila, Miles had called her, stepped forward. Why would you do this? You don't know us. We're not your responsibility. Evelyn had asked herself the same question during the walk back to the wagon.
The answer had come to her slowly, pulled from memories she usually kept buried. "When I was 12, Evelyn said quietly, my mother died. My father remarried quickly. He needed someone to manage the household, and I was too young. My stepmother wasn't cruel exactly, but she made it clear I was a burden she hadn't chosen. Everything I did was wrong. I was too bookish, too willful, not pretty enough, not quiet enough, not grateful enough. By the time I was 16, I was working as a seamstress, sending money home, barely eating so I could afford a tiny room. I taught myself to read better, to write well, to do arithmetic. I clawed my way into a teaching position that paid barely enough to survive. I spent 11 years building a life out of nothing but determination and spite." She looked at each child in turn. "I know what it's like to be unwanted, to be a problem people wish they didn't have to solve. I know what it's like to be told you should be grateful for scraps. And I know what it's like to refuse to accept that as your fate. You children survived 2 weeks in that cellar by yourselves. You kept the little ones alive. You didn't give up. That's not weakness. That's strength I recognize. That's strength I respect." Miles's grip on the knife had loosened slightly. "We don't need charity." "Good, because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a partnership. You know this land, this climate, how to survive here. I know how to read, write, keep records, navigate legal systems. Together, we might have a chance. Apart, we're all going back to lives we'd rather avoid. So what do you say? Do we try?" The children looked at each other, holding silent conversations and glances and subtle gestures. These children had learned to communicate without words, to read each other's fears and needs, to function as a unit. They'd survived by trusting each other when they couldn't trust anyone else. Finally, Lila spoke. "If we try this, and it doesn't work, you don't get to just leave us somewhere and walk away. If we're doing this, we're doing it all the way. All of us together, or not at all." "Agreed," Evelyn said without hesitation. "And we get a say in decisions, about the homestead, about what we build, all of it. You're not just taking over and bossing us around." "Agreed." "And the twins stay with me," a small voice piped up. One of the younger girls, maybe 7, clutching the hand of a toddler. "Nobody separates us." "Nobody separates anyone," Evelyn promised. "We're a family now. Families stay together." Miles finally lowered the knife. "The root cellar's not going to fit 9 people comfortably. Then we make it fit uncomfortably until we can do better. Show me what we're working with." The root cellar was worse than Evelyn had imagined. Built into the hillside behind where the house had stood, it had been designed for food storage, not habitation. Perhaps 8 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling so low even the children had to stoop. The fire had caused part of the entrance to collapse, cutting off much of the ventilation. The children had been living in what was essentially a tomb, dark, cold, damp, with barely enough air. But it was shelter, and shelter was everything. "First priority is making this safe and livable," Evelyn said, mentally cataloging problems. "We need to clear the entrance properly, shore up the ceiling, improve ventilation. We need bedding, real bedding, not just whatever you've been using. We need a stove or at least a safe way to heat the space. We need food supplies to get through winter. We need everything," Lila said flatly. "How do we pay for everything?" Evelyn pulled out her purse and dumped its contents into her palm. $13.87. She'd spent 50 cents on the boarding house room. "This is what we have. We'll have to make it count." Miles laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That won't even cover a week's worth of food for 9 people. Then we get creative. The homestead claim might be worth something. The land office might extend credit based on the claim. The church might have supplies. We can salvage material from the burned buildings. We can hunt, trap, forage. We can work ourselves to death," Miles finished. "You really think this is possible?" Evelyn looked at the 8 thin, exhausted, traumatized children staring at her. She thought about Thomas Hart's letters, about his dream of building something lasting. She thought about her own 11 years of clawing her way toward a better life, of refusing to accept that her circumstances defined her limits. "I think," she said slowly, "that possible and impossible are just words. What matters is what we actually do. So let's start doing." The first task was practical and immediate, getting the children clean.
Evelyn heated water from the well using a salvaged pot and the campfire Fletcher had suggested she build. The children took turns washing, modest and embarrassed, while Evelyn examined them for injuries or illness. They were malnourished, covered in minor cuts and bruises, their feet wrapped in rags that had once been clothing. But they were alive, and in better shape than they had any right to be. The second task was inventory. What did they actually have to work with? The list was devastating. 1 dull knife, 3 tin cups, a cracked pot, some rope, the clothes on their backs, a few charred tools salvaged from the ruins, and whatever was left in the collapsed cellar, mostly empty storage barrels and dirt. The third task was planning. Evelyn made the children sit with her around the fire as the sun began to set, and together they mapped out survival priorities. "We have 3 immediate problems," Evelyn said: shelter, food, and winter supplies. The cellar can house us temporarily if we make improvements. For food, we'll need to combine multiple strategies: hunting, trapping, foraging, and purchasing staples with our limited cash. For winter supplies, we need bedding, warmer clothes, firewood, and a safe heat source. What am I missing? Safety, Miles said grimly. The raiders could come back. Evelyn had been trying not to think about that. How many were there? Do you know why they attacked? Miles's face went hard. 6 of them. They've been hitting homesteads across the territory, taking whatever they want. Pa tried to fight them off. Ma too. They didn't stand a chance. Lila wrapped her arms around 2 of the smaller children, who'd started crying at the memory. We hid in the cellar. Pa had built it strong, with a hidden entrance. They didn't find us. But we heard everything. The weight of trauma settled over the group like a blanket. These children had listened while their parents were murdered. They'd hidden in the dark, terrified, waiting for death. And then they'd emerged to find their home destroyed and their lives shattered. "I'm so sorry," Evelyn said softly. "I can't imagine how frightening that was. But you survived. You stayed together, you protected each other, and now we're going to make sure you're safe. That means being smart about this place, keeping watch, having escape routes, maybe even building defenses if we can." "Against 6 armed men?" Miles shook his head. "We'd need a miracle. Or we need to be too much trouble to be worth attacking," Evelyn said. "Raiders go after easy targets. If we make this homestead look occupied, defended, and more work than it's worth, they might pass us by. It's not perfect, but it's something." As darkness fell completely, they retreated to the root cellar. Evelyn insisted the children take the driest spots while she positioned herself near the entrance, the small pistol Fletcher had given her within easy reach. 9 people in a space meant for storing vegetables created a strange intimacy. She could hear every breath, every small movement, every quiet whimper from the youngest children who were still afraid of the dark. "Miss Evelyn?" a small voice called out. One of the middle children, Grace, they told her. "Yes?" "Are you really going to stay? People always say they'll help, and then they leave." Evelyn thought carefully before answering. These children had been abandoned by their community, left to die because helping them was too hard, too complicated, too expensive. They'd been failed by every adult who should have protected them. "I'm really going to stay," Evelyn said firmly. "I promise you, Grace. I didn't come 1,500 miles to quit when things got hard. We're in this together now, all of us. And tomorrow, we start building something that will last." In the darkness, she heard quiet crying, quickly muffled. But there was something else, too. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if 9 people who'd been holding their breath were finally beginning to exhale. Evelyn lay awake long after the children fell asleep, listening to the prairie wind howl outside their fragile shelter. She was 27 years old, essentially penniless, responsible for 8 orphans, camped in a root cellar on a burned-out homestead in territory where murderers roamed free. She had no plan beyond survive until tomorrow, and no backup if things went wrong. It was absolutely, completely insane. And yet, in the darkness, listening to the breathing of 8 children who'd refused to give up even when they had every reason to, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope that had driven her to answer a mail-order bride advertisement, not the bitter hope that comes from having no other options, but real hope, fragile and new, like a seedling pushing up through hard ground. They would probably fail. The odds were stacked impossibly against them. But for the first time in her adult life, Evelyn was doing something that mattered for reasons beyond simple survival. She was protecting children who desperately needed protection. She was trying to build something meaningful. She was refusing to accept that cruelty and hardship got the final word. Tomorrow would bring 100 new problems and challenges. But tonight, 9 people who'd been alone were alone no longer. And sometimes that was enough to start with. Dawn came too soon, and not soon enough. Evelyn woke to the sound of children stirring in the cramped darkness, small bodies trying to move without disturbing others, whispered conversations about who needed to use the privy first and whether there was any food left. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through impossible calculations, how to stretch $13 across 9 people, how to winterize a root cellar never meant for habitation, how to keep children safe when she barely knew how to keep herself alive. "Miss Evelyn?" Miles stood at the entrance, silhouetted against the gray morning light. "You're awake." "I am." She pushed herself upright, every muscle protesting. The cold had seeped into her bones overnight, despite her wool coat. How much worse must it be for the children in their thin, ragged clothing? "We need to get to town. Make a list of everything, and I mean everything. We need to survive the next month." Lila appeared beside her brother, already holding a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil they'd salvaged from the ruins. "I've been keeping track. It's long." "Show me." The list was devastating in its completeness. Flour, cornmeal, salt, sugar, lard, beans, dried meat, coffee, blankets, winter coats, boots, nails, lumber, a stove, lamp oil, matches, soap, medicine, fabric for clothing. Lila had even estimated quantities based on 9 people lasting through a Dakota winter. "This would cost at least $60, Evelyn said quietly. "Probably more." "I know." Lila's voice was flat, resigned. "I told you, we have nothing." Evelyn studied the girl more closely in the morning light. 12 years old, maybe 13, with her father's steady gaze and a competence far beyond her years. She'd been managing her siblings' survival while grieving her parents' murder. She'd kept them organized, rationed food, maintained hope. This child was remarkable. "We'll figure it out," Evelyn said. "Get everyone ready. We're going back to Redemption Crossing." The wagon ride back was crowded and uncomfortable. 9 people crammed into a space meant for 4. The younger children sat on laps, the older ones perched on the sides, everyone holding on as the wagon lurched over the rough road. But there was something almost hopeful about it. Voices talking instead of whispering, children pointing out prairie dogs and hawks, the twins laughing when the wagon hit a particularly deep rut. Fletcher's expression when Evelyn returned with 8 additional passengers was priceless. Shock, confusion, then a slow understanding that made his weathered face soften slightly. "Hart's kids," he said, not a question. "Hart's kids?" Evelyn confirmed. "They've been surviving in the root cellar since the raid." Fletcher swore softly. 2 weeks? How the hell? He stopped, glancing at the children. "Never mind. You keeping them?" "Yes." "You're crazier than I thought." But he said it almost fondly. "You'll need supplies, lots of them. You got money?" "Some. Not enough." Fletcher looked at the children, then back at Evelyn. "Tibbs at the general store is a hard man, but he's not completely heartless. And Marjorie Blackwood has a soft spot for orphans. Lost her own kids to scarlet fever years back. Might be they'll extend you credit if you ask right." "What's asking right look like out here?" "Honesty? Frontier folks don't have patience for fancy words or manipulation. You tell them the situation straight, tell them what you need, tell them how you plan to make it work. Then you let them decide." Fletcher handed Miles the horse's lead rope. "Boy, you know how to care for a horse?" Miles nodded. "Then you and your siblings take care of unhitching and rubbing her down. She needs water and feed. Miss Hart and I need to talk business." The children scrambled to follow instructions with an efficiency that spoke to their upbringing. Thomas Hart had clearly taught them to work, to contribute, to take responsibility. Watching them, Evelyn felt a fresh wave of grief for the man she'd never meet, a man who'd been building something good before violence destroyed it. "You know what you're taking on?" Fletcher asked once the children were out of earshot. 8 kids, dead of winter coming, no house, no money, no experience ranching. Most men would consider those odds impossible." "I'm not most men." No, you're not. You're one woman with a death wish or a hero complex. I haven't decided which. He pulled out a pipe, tamping tobacco into it with practiced motions. But I'll tell you something true. Those kids needed somebody. County was going to split them up next week, soon as the circuit judge came through. Miles would have gone to one farm, Lila to another, the little ones scattered like seeds. That boy swore he'd run first, take them all into the prairie, and take their chances. Evelyn's throat tightened. He would have done it too. Damn right he would have. Which means they'd have been dead by Christmas. Fletcher lit his pipe, the smoke curling up into the cold morning air. So maybe you're crazy for taking this on, but at least you're crazy in a direction that might save some lives. I'll spread the word. Hart's mail-order bride is filing the homestead claim and keeping the kids together. Folks might surprise you. The general store was a revelation in frontier commerce. Everything from nails to nightgowns crammed into a space hardly bigger than Evelyn's Boston boarding house room. Tibbs, the proprietor, was a lean man with sharp eyes and the air of someone who'd calculated the profit margin on everything in his store down to the penny. Miss Hart, he nodded at her entrance, heard you arrived yesterday. Condolences about Thomas. Thank you. I'm here because I need supplies and I need to be honest about my situation. She laid it out plainly. The children, the burned homestead, the determination to file the claim and rebuild, the limited resources. She showed him Lila's list and asked him to price it. Tibbs studied the list for a long moment, his expression unreadable. This would run you about $75, maybe $80, depending on quality. You say you have $13? Yes. That's not even close, Miss Hart. I know, which is why I'm asking for credit. I'll pay you back with interest once we start producing something to sell. Thomas Hart had plans for a working ranch, cattle, possibly wheat, maybe a way station for travelers. I intend to make those plans work. Those plans required Thomas Hart, a man who knew ranching, knew the land, knew how to survive out here. No offense, but you're a city woman with no experience and a pile of hungry mouths to feed. How do I know you won't just fail and leave me holding the debt? It was a fair question. Evelyn couldn't even argue with his logic. She was asking him to gamble on something that looked like a guaranteed loss. You don't know, she admitted. But let me tell you what I do know. Those 8 children survived 2 weeks alone in a collapsed root cellar with almost no food and no help. They kept themselves organized, kept the youngest ones safe, and didn't give up. That's not weakness, Mr. Tibbs. That's the kind of strength that builds something lasting. I'm educated, I'm resourceful, and I've spent 11 years surviving on determination alone. Together, we have a chance, not a guarantee. I won't insult you with false promises, but a chance. And sometimes a chance is all anyone gets. Tibbs drummed his fingers on the counter, thinking. The store was quiet except for the ticking of a clock and the sound of children's voices outside, where they waited with the wagon. I'll give you $30 in credit, he said finally. Enough for basics, flour, cornmeal, beans, salt, lard, some lamp oil and matches. That'll keep you fed through winter if you're careful. But not the winter clothes, not the lumber, not the stove. You'll have to find those elsewhere or do without. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. But it was more than Evelyn had expected, and far more generous than Tibbs probably should have offered. Thank you, she said, meaning it. I won't forget this. You're damn right you won't, because I'll be collecting come spring, with interest. But his expression had softened slightly. And Miss Hart? There's a church gathering on Sunday. You should come, bring the kids. Frontier communities take care of their own, and those children are Thomas Hart's legacy. Folks might be willing to help if they see you're serious about this. The next stop was Marjorie Blackwood's boarding house. The older woman was in her kitchen, kneading bread dough with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been feeding people for decades. You're back, Marjorie said, not looking up from her work. And you brought the Hart children. How did you Small town. Word travels faster than prairie fire. She finally looked up, her eyes sharp and assessing. You planning to keep them? Yes? You know that's impossible. Several people have mentioned that. Marjorie wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and came around the counter. Show me the children. They were still by the wagon, taking turns giving the horse water from a bucket Miles had found. Marjorie stood in the doorway watching them, the way Miles supervised but didn't micromanage, The way Lila helped the smallest ones reach the bucket, the way they worked together like a well-practiced unit. Thomas's wife, Mary was her name, she was a good woman, Marjorie said quietly. Practical, strong, loved those children fierce. Thomas too, though he wasn't one for big emotional displays. They came out here 5 years ago, full of hope and plans, built that homestead from nothing, and then raiders took it all away in one night. I'm going to rebuild it, Evelyn said, with the children, for the children. With what? You need money for that, girl, money you don't have. I need a lot of things I don't have, but I'm willing to work for them. Evelyn turned to face the older woman directly. Mrs. Blackwood, Fletcher said you have experience with loss, that you understand what it means to lose children. I'm asking, not as charity, but as one woman to another, is there anything you can do to help? Even advice would be valuable. Marjorie's expression flickered, pain, memory, something that might have been respect. Come inside and bring those children. They look half-starved. The boarding house kitchen was warm and smelled like bread and coffee. Marjorie sat the children at her large wooden table and, without asking permission, began serving them. Thick slices of bread with butter, hard-boiled eggs, milk that made the younger one's eyes widen with delight. She worked in silence while they ate, and Evelyn watched as 8 traumatized, wary children slowly began to relax in the presence of food and warmth. My husband and I came out here 30 years ago, Marjorie said finally, setting a cup of coffee in front of Evelyn. Had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Scarlet fever took all 3 in 1 week. I thought I'd die too, from grief if nothing else. But I didn't. I kept cooking, kept running this place, kept waking up every morning. Eventually I realized something. Grief doesn't go away, but you can build something alongside it. Something that honors what you lost. She sat down heavily, her joints creaking. I have blankets, quilts I made years ago that nobody uses. I have winter coats that were my boys. They'd be too big for your youngest, but they'd fit the older children. I have fabric scraps for patching, and I have something else that might be more valuable than any of that. What? Evelyn asked. I have connections. There's a carpenter, name of Samuel Reed, who drinks too much and works too little, but he's skilled when he's sober. Lost his wife last year, been wandering ever since. Might be he'd work for food and a place to sleep, help you shore up that root cellar, and maybe build some basic structures before the real cold hits. And there's Doc Pritchard. He's getting old, could use an apprentice. Your Lila looks smart enough. If she's interested in medicine, he might teach her in exchange for help around his office. Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. Hope, real and tangible. Why would you do this? Because I'm an old woman who's seen too much death and not enough people willing to fight against it. Marjorie's voice was gruff. And because those children deserve better than what happened to them. And because you, foolish as you are, remind me of myself 30 years ago, too stubborn to know when to quit. Miles looked up from his bread, his expression cautious. If we take your help, what do you want in return? Smart boy, Marjorie smiled slightly. I want you children to survive. I want you to learn skills, work hard, and build something your parents would be proud of. And someday, when you're grown and established, I want you to help the next desperate person who shows up with nothing but determination. That's how the frontier works. We lift each other up, and someday they lift someone else. That afternoon was a whirlwind of activity. Marjorie loaded the wagon with quilts, coats, and fabric. She packed a crate with preserved vegetables from her own cellar, carrots, turnips, pickled beets. She added a jar of salve for cuts and bruises, a precious bottle of laudanum for emergencies, and a cookbook with recipes adjusted for frontier cooking. Doc Pritchard arrived after hearing about the situation from Marjorie. He was 70 if he was a day, with gentle hands and keen eyes that missed nothing. He examined each child briefly, noting their malnutrition, their various minor injuries, the psychological trauma evident in how they startled at sudden sounds. They'll need good food, rest, and safety, he told Evelyn. The physical wounds will heal. The other wounds take longer. He turned to Lila. Your name's Lila? Marjorie says you're the one who kept everyone alive in that cellar. Lila nodded warily. That took intelligence and courage. I could use someone intelligent and courageous in my practice. I'm getting old. My hands shake sometimes,
My memory isn't what it was. If you're interested, I'll teach you anatomy, medicine, how to treat injuries and illnesses. It's hard work, often unpleasant, and people will doubt you because you're young and female, but it's work that matters. Lila glanced at Evelyn, then back at the doctor. I can still help at the homestead? Of course. We'll work around the homestead schedule. Few hours a week to start, more as you learn. Then yes, I want to learn. Samuel Reed was harder to track down. They found him at the saloon, nursing a whiskey at 2 in the afternoon. He was perhaps 40, with the solid build of a man who'd spent years working with his hands, and the haunted expression of someone trying to drink away memories. Mr. Reed? Evelyn approached cautiously. My name is Evelyn Hart. I'm told you're a skilled carpenter. Was. His voice was rough. Not much lately. I have a proposition. I'm rebuilding the Hart homestead with 8 children. We need someone who knows construction, someone who can shore up a root cellar, build basic structures, maybe teach some skills to teenagers willing to learn. I can't pay you in money, but I can offer food, shelter, and purpose. Reed laughed bitterly. Purpose? That's a hell of an offer. It's the only offer I have. But those children are living in a collapsed root cellar with winter coming. They need help. I need help. And Marjorie Blackwood says you need something to work toward. So maybe we help each other. He studied her for a long moment, and Evelyn could see him calculating, weighing his grief and self-destruction against the possibility of something different, something that might matter. I'll give you 2 weeks, he said finally. If I'm useless, you send me back. But if I can help, if it feels like it means something, maybe I stay longer. That's all I'm asking. By the time they loaded Samuel Reed and all their new supplies into the wagon, it was late afternoon. The trip back to the homestead took twice as long with the extra weight, but nobody complained. The children were warm in their oversized coats, wrapped in quilts, excitedly discussing the food they'd eat and the structures they'd build. Evelyn sat beside Samuel Reed on the wagon seat, Miles on her other side, and felt the weight of what she'd set in motion. She'd made promises to merchants, accepted charity from strangers, and recruited a grieving alcoholic carpenter to help rebuild a burned homestead. It was reckless and optimistic, and probably doomed to failure. But as they crested the last hill and saw the blackened remains of the Hart homestead in the valley below, Evelyn also saw something else: potential. The land itself was good, with water from the well and creek, shelter in the hills, grass for future livestock. The destruction was total, but destruction meant possibility. They could build whatever they needed, design it for 9 people working together, create something new from the ashes of tragedy. All right, Evelyn said as they pulled to a stop. First priority is winterizing the root cellar. Mr. Reed, what do we need? Samuel climbed down, stretching his back with an audible crack. He walked around the collapsed entrance, examining the structure with professional assessment. The ceiling needs support beams. Good news is there's plenty of burned timber we can salvage if we're careful. We need to dig out the entrance properly, maybe build a small mud room to trap cold air. We need ventilation that won't let in snow, and we need some kind of stove or heating system, or you'll all freeze. Can we do it with what we have? With what you have? No. With what we have, plus salvage, plus hard work, plus some creative problem solving? Maybe. He looked at Miles. You know how to swing a hammer? Yes, sir. Good. You're my primary assistant. Anyone else want to learn carpentry? 3 more hands shot up. Rowan, an 8-year-old boy with determined eyes, and 2 of the middle children, Grace and Caleb. Samuel nodded approvingly. Then let's get started. Daylight's burning. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Evelyn's life. They worked from first light until darkness, every day, without exception. Samuel Reed taught the children carpentry basics, while Evelyn and Lila organized the supplies, rationed food, and maintained their makeshift household. They salvaged timber from the burned buildings, carefully testing each piece for structural integrity. They dug out the root cellar entrance, shored up the ceiling with crossbeams, and built a small vestibule that would trap cold air before it reached the main chamber. They didn't have a proper stove, but Samuel rigged a ventilated firebox from salvaged metal and stones, with a chimney made from stovepipe he'd traded labor to acquire from the blacksmith. It was crude, dangerous, if not carefully monitored,
but it generated heat and allowed for cooking. Evelyn filed the homestead claim at the land office, presenting herself as Thomas Hart's intended wife, who was now serving as guardian to his children. The clerk was skeptical, but the law was clear. Family members could inherit claims, and her status as intended spouse gave her legal standing, however unusual. The paperwork would take months to fully process, but in the meantime, the land was theirs. The children transformed before her eyes. With regular food, warmth, and purpose, they began to recover. Miles grew protective of Samuel, following him everywhere, absorbing every skill the carpenter shared. Lila spent 3 afternoons a week with Doc Pritchard, learning to clean wounds, mix remedies, and identify symptoms. The younger children took on age-appropriate tasks, hauling water, gathering kindling, mending clothes. But the work took its toll. Evelyn's hands blistered and bled from labor she'd never trained for. Her back ached constantly. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Samuel fell off the wagon twice, disappearing to the saloon until Miles would find him and talk him back. The weather grew colder and several children developed coughs that terrified Evelyn until Doc Pritchard assured her they were minor. "You're pushing too hard," Lila told her one evening as Evelyn struggled to calculate their remaining food supplies by lamplight. "You need to rest." "I'll rest when winter comes and the work slows down." "Winter's already here. Look outside." Evelyn glanced up and saw snow falling, light, delicate flakes that seemed innocent but promised months of brutal cold. The first real snow of the season. They'd been racing against this moment, and now it had arrived. "Is the root cellar ready?" Evelyn asked. Samuel says yes. "As ready as we can make it with what we have." That night, they all gathered in their winterized shelter for the first time as a complete household. The space was still cramped, still uncomfortable, but it was dry and surprisingly warm with the firebox glowing. Samuel had built basic sleeping platforms along the walls, creating more usable space. Marjorie's quilts covered every surface. The supplies from Tibbs' store were neatly organized on salvaged shelving. It wasn't much. By any reasonable standard, it was poverty and hardship. But it was theirs. They'd built it together, from nothing, against impossible odds. "Before we sleep," Evelyn said, "I want to say something. We've been so focused on survival that we haven't talked about what we're actually doing here. We're not just surviving winter, we're building a home, a real home for all of us. This isn't temporary. This isn't just until something better comes along. This is our family, our land, our future." She looked at each child in the lamplight. "I need you all to understand. I chose this. I chose you. Not because I felt obligated, not because I had no other options. But because when I saw you in that cellar, I saw strength and courage and resilience. I saw people worth fighting for. And I intend to keep fighting, through this winter and beyond it, until we've built something that can't be taken away." Miles spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. "Pa used to say that family isn't just blood. It's the people who show up when things get hard and don't leave." "Your pa was a smart man." "He was." Miles swallowed hard. "He'd have liked you, Miss Evelyn. He'd have been proud of what we're building." The younger children were crying now, grief and relief mixing together. Evelyn gathered them close, all 8 of them, and felt the weight of responsibility and love in equal measure. These children had lost everything, suffered unimaginable trauma, and survived against all odds. She would not let them down. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the prairie in white. Inside their small underground shelter, 9 people who'd been strangers a month ago held each other and faced the winter together. The weeks that followed established their rhythm. Wake before dawn, build up the fire, prepare breakfast from their limited supplies, usually cornmeal mush with a bit of lard and salt, occasionally supplemented with eggs from the 3 chickens they'd coaxed back to the repaired coop. After breakfast, work began. The older children had specific responsibilities. Miles and Rowan worked with Samuel on ongoing construction projects. They were building a small above-ground cabin that would serve as a workshop and storage, with plans to expand it into proper living quarters by spring. Lila spent her time between helping Evelyn and studying with Doc Pritchard. Grace, at 10 years old, was their best forager. She had an uncanny ability to find edible roots and plants even in winter. Caleb and the twin girls, Emma and Eliza, managed the chickens and helped with water hauling. The youngest, little Thomas, named for his father, stayed close to Evelyn helping with small tasks and providing unexpected moments of joy. Samuel Reed transformed week by week. The work seemed to pull him back from whatever darkness he'd been drowning in. He taught the children with patience, showing them how to measure twice and cut once, how to read wood grain, how to make something beautiful from rough materials. And slowly, tentatively, he began to smile again. "You saved my life," he told Evelyn one evening while they worked on securing the cabin's roof. "I was drinking myself to death, and I knew it, and I didn't care. But these kids, watching them build something after losing everything, it reminded me why life's worth living." "You saved ours too," Evelyn said. "We couldn't have survived without your skills." "Maybe we saved each other then." Maybe that's how it works out here. Word of their efforts spread through the small frontier community. Some people were skeptical, predicting failure before the next hard freeze. But others were impressed, even inspired. Neighbors began stopping by, sometimes offering help, sometimes just wanting to see the crazy mail-order bride and her brood of orphans who decided to rebuild in the face of impossible odds. A farmer named Jensen donated a milk cow whose production had slowed. "She's past her prime, but she's got a few years left. Might help feed those children." The blacksmith's wife brought preserved fruits and a worn but serviceable cooking pot. "My children are grown. I remember what it's like to feed a large family." Even Tibbs from the general store appeared one Sunday afternoon with a small bag of peppermint sticks. "For the children," he said gruffly. "Consider it an investment in future customers." The community's slow acceptance meant everything. Evelyn had worried they'd be seen as charity cases, as outsiders taking advantage of frontier generosity. Instead, they were becoming part of the fabric of Redemption Crossing, people who'd faced tragedy and chosen to rebuild rather than retreat. But not everyone was supportive. Clayton Morse, a rancher who owned significant land adjacent to the Hart claim, made his opposition clear when he rode up one afternoon in early December. "Miss Hart," he said, not dismounting, "I'm here to make you a reasonable offer. $50 for your homestead claim, and I'll find county placement for the children." Evelyn straightened from the firewood she'd been stacking. "The homestead isn't for sale, Mr. Morse." "You're being foolish. You can't possibly succeed here. A woman alone with 8 children. That land is wasted on you. I could use it for grazing. Make it productive." "It is productive. We're building a working homestead." Morse's expression hardened. "You're squatting in a hole in the ground and pretending it's a home. Come spring, when your credit runs out and your supplies are gone, you'll be begging the county to take those children off your hands. I'm offering you an escape now with some money in your pocket." "No. You're making a mistake." "That's my mistake to make." Morse leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to something almost threatening. "This territory isn't kind to people who don't know their place. You're playing at being a rancher, playing at being a mother to children who aren't yours. When reality catches up, don't come crying to me." He rode off, leaving Evelyn shaking with anger and fear. Because Morse was partially right. They were barely surviving, living on charity and determination and not much else. The food would run out eventually. The winter would test them in ways she couldn't predict. And if she failed, those children would pay the price. "Don't listen to him," Miles said, emerging from the root cellar. "Men like Morse, they think the only way to succeed is to take from others. They don't understand people like us." "People like us?" "People who build instead of steal. People who help instead of hurt." Miles's young face was set with determination that made him look older than 14. "Pa always said the strongest thing a person can do is choose kindness when the world gives them every reason to be cruel. You chose us, Miss Evelyn. You chose kindness. That's not weakness. That's strength. Morse will never understand." That night, as snow piled up outside and wind howled across the prairie, Evelyn lay awake thinking about choices and consequences. She'd chosen this path knowing it was nearly impossible. She'd promised these children a future she wasn't sure she could deliver. She'd committed to rebuilding not just a homestead, but a family, a community, a life. And somewhere in the darkness, she realized she didn't regret it. Not even a little. Because for the first time in her 27 years, she was building something that mattered for reasons beyond survival. She was protecting children who desperately needed protection. She was proving that tragedy didn't have to be the end of the story. that sometimes, if you were brave enough and stubborn enough, you could write a different ending. The next morning brought fresh snow and fresh resolve. They were no longer just surviving day to day. They were building something that would last, building it slowly, painfully, imperfectly, but building it nonetheless. And in the root cellar that had become their home, 9 people who'd started as strangers had become something stronger. They'd become a family forged in fire and rebuilt from ashes. Winter deepened with a ferocity that made the early snows seem gentle by comparison. By mid-January, temperatures plunged so low that water left in buckets overnight froze solid. The wind came shrieking across the prairie like something alive and malicious, finding every gap in their shelter, every weakness in their defenses. But inside the root cellar, the family Evelyn had built endured. They'd settled into a rhythm born of necessity and cooperation. Samuel had completed the small cabin above ground, and though it wasn't large enough for sleeping quarters, it provided crucial space for work and storage that kept the root cellar from becoming completely uninhabitable. The children had learned skills that would have taken years to acquire back east. Miles could now frame a wall nearly as well as Samuel. Lila could set a broken bone and mix a fever remedy. Grace knew which roots and bark could be eaten, even in deep winter. But the strain was showing. Their food supplies, carefully rationed, were dwindling faster than Evelyn had calculated. The cornmeal barrel was half empty. The beans were running low. The preserved vegetables from Marjorie were nearly gone. Evelyn had started reducing her own portions, giving extra to the growing children, and she could feel her clothes hanging looser despite the layers she wore against the cold. "You're not eating enough," Lila said one morning, watching Evelyn divide breakfast into 9 portions that seemed to shrink daily. "I'm eating what I need." "You're lying. I can see it in your face. You're giving us your share." Lila's medical training had made her observant in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable. "If you get sick, we all suffer. You need to eat properly." "We'll get more supplies soon. Doc Pritchard said the circuit rider should arrive by month's end with deliveries from the territorial capital. We can purchase additional staples then."
With what money? We're already in debt to Tibbs for $40. You think he'll extend more credit? It was a fair question, and one Evelyn didn't have a good answer for. Their situation had stabilized, but stability wasn't the same as security. They were one disaster away from collapse, one serious illness, one major expense, one harsh stroke of bad luck. That disaster arrived on a Friday night in late January, carried on a blizzard wind that would have kept any sensible person sheltered indoors. The first warning was the dogs. Several weeks earlier, a pair of half-wild prairie dogs had started hanging around the homestead, drawn by scraps the children left out. Miles had gradually tamed them, and they'd become unofficial guardians, alert to any approaching danger. That night, they began barking frantically, a sound that cut through even the howling wind. Evelyn was awake instantly, her hand reaching for the pistol she now kept within reach at all times. Around her the children stirred, confusion turning to fear as the dogs' barking intensified. "Miles," Evelyn whispered urgently, "get everyone up, quietly." Miles moved through the shelter with practiced efficiency, rousing his siblings with gentle touches and whispered words. They'd discussed this scenario, had drilled for it, in fact, during the long winter evenings. If danger came, everyone had a role. Samuel Reed emerged from the small cabin above, rifle in hand. "Riders," he called down. "At least 4, maybe more, coming up the eastern approach." 4 riders, in a blizzard, in the middle of the night. Nobody traveled in these conditions unless they had a specific, urgent purpose. And given the Hart homestead's history with raiders, that purpose was unlikely to be friendly. "Everyone into the positions we practiced," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Lila, take the youngest to the back. Grace, Emma, Eliza, you know what to do. Rowan, Caleb, with Miles. Move." The children scattered with a discipline that would have been impressive under any circumstances, but was particularly remarkable given their terror. They'd survived one attack by hiding. They would not survive another the same way. Over the past months, Samuel had helped them fortify the homestead with raiders specifically in mind. The root cellar had a reinforced door that could be barred from inside. The small cabin above had gun ports, narrow openings that allowed defenders to shoot out while providing minimal target area. They'd stockpiled rocks that could be thrown, improvised weapons from farm tools, and most importantly, they'd created escape routes and fallback positions. How many rifles do we have? Evelyn asked Samuel. 2. Mine and the one I taught Miles to use. You've got your pistol. That's it. 3 guns against at least 4 raiders. The math was not encouraging. The riders appeared out of the blizzard like ghosts, their faces wrapped against the cold, hats pulled low. They fanned out around the homestead, clearly experienced at this kind of approach. One held a torch, its flame guttering wildly in the wind but providing enough light to see by. "Hello, the house!" one of them called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful and nobody gets hurt." Evelyn recognized that voice. She'd heard it before, described by Miles during the terrible night he'd recounted his parents' murder. This was the same gang. They'd come back. "What do they want?" Lila whispered from the back of the shelter, clutching the twins. "Probably heard about the improvements we've made," Samuel said grimly. "Think we've got supplies worth stealing. Or maybe they're just angry we're still here when they tried to wipe out this homestead once before." Miles appeared at Evelyn's shoulder, carrying the rifle Samuel had trained him on. His hands were steady, his face set with a determination that was equal parts courage and rage. "I'm not hiding this time. Miles, they killed my parents. I hid then because I had to protect my siblings. But we're not helpless anymore. We've built defenses. We've prepared. And I'm not letting them take what we've built." Evelyn looked at this 14-year-old boy who'd been forced to become a man far too young and made a decision that went against every protective instinct she had. "You take the north gun port in the cabin. Samuel takes the south. I'll defend the root cellar entrance. Nobody fires unless they breach our perimeter. Understood?" "Understood." "And Miles, your parents would be proud of the man you're becoming, but they'd also want you alive. Don't take stupid risks." He nodded once, then climbed the ladder to the cabin above, moving with the careful precision of someone who knew a single mistake could be fatal. The raider called out again, "We can wait all night, or we can burn you out like we did before. Your choice." Evelyn positioned herself at the reinforced door, peering through a narrow gap. The raiders had dismounted, moving closer to the cabin. They were armed. She could see rifles, pistols, the torch that could indeed burn them out if the raiders got close enough to the wooden structures. But something else struck her about the scene. These men looked cold, tired, almost desperate. Their horses were thin, their clothing inadequate for the brutal winter. They weren't the confident, casual murderers Miles had described from that terrible night. They were struggling too, pushed to extremity by the harsh Dakota winter. It didn't make them less dangerous. If anything, it made them more so. Desperate men did desperate things. "Listen to me," Evelyn called out, her voice carrying across the snow. "I know why you're here. You're cold, hungry, desperate. This winter has been hard on everyone. But we don't have much, just enough to survive. If you take what little we have, you'll be killing 8 children. Is that what you want on your conscience?" Laughter came from one of the raiders. "Lady, we've got bigger sins than that already. Besides, you're lying. We've heard about this place, about the improvements, the supplies coming in. You've got food stores, and we need them. We have barely enough food for 9 people to make it to spring. Take it, and you murder children. Is that what you've become? Save your preaching for the church, lady. You've got 1 minute to come out or we're coming in." Samuel appeared in the gun port above, his rifle trained on the raiders. "You're trespassing on private property. Leave now or face the consequences." One of the raiders raised his own rifle toward Samuel's position. "You got maybe 2 guns in there. We've got 4 rifles and experience using them. This doesn't have to be a fight, but if you want one, we'll oblige." The tension ratcheted up instantly. Fingers moved to triggers. The blizzard howled around them, creating an eerie soundtrack to the standoff. Evelyn could hear the younger children crying softly in the back of the shelter, could feel her own heart hammering against her ribs. Everything she'd built, everything they'd survived, was about to collapse into violence and death. She'd promised these children safety, a future, a home, and now she was about to fail them in the most catastrophic way possible. "Wait," she called out. "Just wait. Give me a moment to think." 30 seconds. Evelyn's mind raced. They couldn't win a straight fight. The raiders had more guns, more experience, and nothing to lose. But they also couldn't surrender. The raiders would take everything, possibly harm the children, and leave them to freeze. There had to be another option,
some strategy that gave them a chance. Then she remembered something Fletcher had said months ago. Raiders go after easy targets. If they could make this fight costly enough, painful enough, maybe the Raiders would decide it wasn't worth it. They didn't need to win. They just needed to survive long enough for the Raiders to retreat. "Miles," she whispered up toward the cabin. "On my signal, fire high, over their heads. Samuel, you do the same. I want them to know we're armed and willing to fight, but I don't want to kill anyone if we can avoid it. If they return fire, that changes things. But let's see if we can scare them off first." "That's a hell of a gamble," Samuel muttered. "Everything about this situation is a gamble, now." 2 rifle shots cracked out simultaneously, the sound deafening in the confined space. Snow exploded where the bullets hit the ground several feet in front of the Raiders. The message was clear: we're armed, we can shoot, and the next ones won't be warnings. The Raiders scattered, taking cover behind their horses and whatever terrain features they could find. Return fire came immediately, bullets slamming into the wooden walls of the cabin, thudding into the packed earth around the root cellar entrance. "Get down!" Evelyn screamed, throwing herself flat as a bullet whistled past where her head had been. From above, she heard Miles working the rifle bolt, getting into position for another shot. Samuel was doing the same from his port. The Raiders were firing more or less continuously now, trying to pin them down while they advanced. One of them broke from cover, running toward the cabin with what looked like an oil-soaked rag and the torch. He was planning to set the building on fire. "Miles, the runner!" Evelyn shouted. Miles's rifle cracked. The Raider went down, clutching his leg, the torch falling into the snow where it hissed and died. The man's screams cut through the night, and Evelyn felt sick. They'd just shot someone. Miles had just shot someone. A 14-year-old boy had been forced to maim another human being to protect his family. But there was no time for guilt or regret. The other Raiders were advancing, using their wounded companion's distraction. 2 of them reached the cabin wall, below where Samuel and Miles could shoot at them. They were going to try to force the door, to get inside where the close quarters would neutralize any advantage the defenders had. Evelyn made a decision. She grabbed one of the heavy rocks they'd stockpiled, threw open the root cellar door, and hurled it with all her strength. It caught one Raider in the shoulder, spinning him around. She grabbed another rock, then another, throwing them as fast as she could. "Rowan, Caleb, help me!" The 2 boys appeared at her side, their faces pale with terror but their hands steady as they grabbed rocks and began throwing. It wasn't sophisticated warfare, but it was effective. The Raiders were forced back, unable to advance against the barrage. From above, Miles and Samuel kept up steady fire, not trying to kill but making it clear that advancing would be costly. The wounded Raider was still screaming, his leg bleeding badly into the snow. His companions were shouting at each other, clearly arguing about whether to press the attack or retreat. Then Grace appeared from somewhere carrying a bucket. Before Evelyn could stop her, the 10-year-old girl threw the contents, dirty wash water mixed with wood ash, directly into the face of the nearest Raider. The man screamed, clawing at his eyes, temporarily blinded. "Back inside!" Evelyn grabbed Grace, pulling her toward the shelter. A bullet impacted the doorframe where the girl had been standing a second earlier. The fight devolved into chaos. Raiders trying to advance, defenders throwing everything they could, gunfire from both sides, the blizzard making visibility nearly impossible. Evelyn lost track of time, functioning on pure adrenaline and terror. She fired her pistol at a shape moving through the snow, heard a curse that suggested she'd at least come close. Then, suddenly, it was over. The Raiders were retreating, dragging their wounded with them, firing covering shots as they mounted their horses. Within minutes, they'd vanished into the blizzard, leaving behind nothing but blood in the snow and the echo of gunshots. Silence descended, broken only by the wind and the sound of children crying. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her pistol still raised, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it. She'd just fought off armed Raiders. She'd thrown rocks like a primitive warrior. She'd put children in danger, let them fight, watched Miles shoot a man. "Is everyone all right?" Samuel called down. "Anyone hurt?" Evelyn forced herself to move, to check each child. Miraculously, they were all unharmed, terrified, traumatized, but physically intact. Miles climbed down from the cabin, his face ashen, still clutching the rifle. "I shot him," Miles said, his voice hollow. "I shot that man." "You saved us." Evelyn said, pulling him into a fierce embrace. You did what you had to do to protect your family. I aimed for his leg. I didn't want to kill him, but I could have. I almost did. But you didn't. You made a choice to wound instead of kill, even in the middle of a fight. That's not something a monster would do. That's something a good man would do. Miles buried his face in her shoulder and shook. This 14-year-old boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast, who'd had to learn carpentry and survival, and now combat, finally allowed himself to be a child again, just for a moment. The other children clustered around them, everyone needing contact, reassurance, proof that they were still alive and together. Even Samuel joined the huddle, this broken carpenter who'd found redemption in protecting a family that wasn't his by blood, but was his in every way that mattered. They'll come back, Lila said quietly. Won't they? Maybe, Evelyn admitted. But we hurt them tonight, made it clear we're not an easy target, and they've got a wounded man who needs care they probably can't provide. My guess is they'll move on to easier prey. And if they don't, then we'll be ready. We defended ourselves once. We can do it again. Evelyn straightened, looking at each of her children in turn. Listen to me, all of you. What happened tonight was terrifying and violent, and none of you should have had to experience it. But you were brave. You worked together. You protected each other. Your parents would be so proud of who you've become. Our parents are dead because of men like that, Caleb said, his young voice bitter. Yes, and that's not fair and it's not right, and I wish I could change it. But we can't let their violence define us. We defended ourselves tonight, but we didn't become like them. We protected rather than destroyed. We fought to preserve rather than to take. That matters. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion crashed over all of them. They returned to the root cellar, barred the door, and huddled together for warmth and comfort. Nobody slept much. Every sound made them jump. Every gust of wind brought fresh fear. But they survived the night, and when gray dawn finally came, they emerged to assess the damage. The cabin walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The snow around the homestead was churned up from the fight, stained with blood in several places. They found spent shell casings, a dropped knife, a hat that must have blown off during the raiders' retreat. Evidence of violence, of how close they'd come to disaster. But they also found something else. When word reached Redemption Crossing about the attack, carried by Fletcher, who'd heard the gunfire from miles away and came to investigate at first light, the community's response was overwhelming. By afternoon, a dozen men had arrived, armed and ready to stand guard. Marjorie Blackwood came with more supplies and fierce determination in her eyes. Doc Pritchard checked everyone over, paying particular attention to Miles, whose hands still trembled from what he'd been forced to do. Even Tibbs from the general store appeared, bringing ammunition and announcing that he was extending their credit again because folks who fight off raiders deserve support. The circuit rider, delayed by the blizzard, arrived 3 days later with mail and supplies. Among the letters was one from the territorial governor's office. Word of the Hart homestead's successful defense had spread quickly. The governor was offering a reward for information leading to the raiders' capture, and was personally commending the homestead's defenders for their courage. You're famous, Fletcher said, showing Evelyn the official letter. People are talking about the mail-order bride who took in 8 orphans and fought off raiders in a blizzard. You're an inspiration. I'm exhausted, Evelyn corrected, and terrified, and barely holding everything together. That's what heroism looks like, Miss Hart. It's not glory and adventure. It's scared people doing what needs doing because nobody else will. Over the following weeks, something shifted in how the community viewed them. They were no longer just charity cases or a curiosity. They'd proven themselves capable, resilient, worthy of respect. Neighbors who'd been skeptical started offering genuine help, teaching Miles about cattle management, showing Grace advanced foraging techniques, discussing crop strategies with Evelyn for when spring finally arrived. Clayton Morse, the rancher who'd tried to buy them out, rode up one afternoon with a very different proposition. I was wrong about you, he said bluntly. You've got backbone, and those children are being raised right. I'm here to offer assistance, not charity, but partnership. I need reliable neighbors, and you've proven you're exactly that. Come spring, I'll loan you breeding cattle to start a herd. You pay me back when they produce. Fair terms, written contract, no tricks. Evelyn studied him carefully,
looking for deception. Why the change of heart? Because I misjudged you, and I'm man enough to admit it. Also because anyone who fights off raiders to protect children is someone I want as an ally, not an enemy. The frontier needs more people like you, Miss Hart. People who build instead of just take. She accepted his offer, sealing it with a handshake that felt like a turning point. That night, gathered around their fire with full bellies, the community had donated so much food they actually had surplus for the first time. Evelyn looked at her family and felt something close to peace. They'd survived the ultimate test. They'd faced violence and responded with courage. They'd protected each other and come through stronger. I've been thinking, Miles said, breaking the comfortable silence, about what we call this place. It was just the Hart Homestead before, but it feels like it should have a real name now, something that means what we've built here. What do you suggest? Evelyn asked. Miles looked around at his siblings, at Samuel, at Evelyn. Phoenix Ranch, because we rose from the ashes. The name was perfect.
It captured everything about their journey, the destruction they'd started from, the rebirth they'd fought for, the strength they'd found together. Evelyn felt tears pricking her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from gratitude and pride and love. Phoenix Ranch it is, she said, and may we never forget what we survived to build it. Outside, the winter wind still howled, and the snow still fell, and the frontier was still harsh and unforgiving. But inside their shelter, 9 people who'd become a family looked toward a future that suddenly seemed possible. They'd defended their home. Now they could begin to truly build it. Spring came late to the Dakota Territory that year, as if winter was reluctant to release its grip on the land it had held so brutally. But when the thaw finally arrived in mid-March, it came with a violence of its own, ice breaking with sounds like gunfire, creeks swelling to rivers, mud so deep it could swallow a wagon wheel. The prairie transformed from white to brown to green in what seemed like days, and with that transformation came possibility. Phoenix Ranch emerged from winter battered but unbroken. The small cabin Samuel had built stood firm, its bullet-scarred walls a reminder of what they'd survived. The root cellar that had sheltered them through the worst months was cramped and damp, but had done its job. And the 9 people who'd huddled together against the cold had grown into something more than just survivors. They'd become a functioning unit, each person vital to the whole. The first order of business was expansion. They couldn't spend another winter in the root cellar, not if they wanted to maintain their sanity and health. Samuel laid out plans for a proper house, modest but sufficient. 2 rooms that could eventually be expanded to 4, with a stone fireplace, real windows, and a loft for the older children. The cost in materials alone would be substantial, but the community that had rallied around them during the raider attack continued to offer support. "I can donate labor," announced Jensen, the farmer who'd given them the milk cow. 2 days a week until the house is up. My boys can help too. They need to learn proper construction anyway. The blacksmith offered to forge nails and hinges at cost. Marjorie Blackwood organized a sewing circle to make curtains and quilts. Even families Evelyn had never met showed up with contributions. A load of stones for the foundation, seasoned lumber salvaged from a barn destroyed in the winter storms, a cast iron stove that was old but functional. "Why are people being so generous?" Grace asked one evening, watching yet another wagon arrive with supplies. "We can't possibly pay them back." "They're not looking for payment," Evelyn explained. "They're investing in the idea of us. Every homestead that succeeds makes this whole territory stronger. When people see a mail-order bride and 8 orphans, not just surviving but building something lasting, it gives them hope that their own struggles aren't futile." Miles, who'd been sketching house designs with Samuel, looked up. "Pa used to say the frontier rewards people who help each other. That competition has its place, but cooperation is what actually builds civilization." Your father was right. Evelyn studied the design Miles had drawn. It showed surprising skill and attention to detail. "You're good at this." "Samuel's been teaching me, says I have an eye for structure." Miles's expression grew thoughtful. "I've been thinking about the future. After we get the house built, we should plan for a barn. A real barn, big enough for livestock and equipment, and maybe a bunkhouse for hired hands, if we ever grow enough to need them." "You're thinking 5 years ahead when we're still trying to survive this season. That's how you build something that lasts, isn't it? You plan beyond your current crisis. The wisdom in those words, coming from a 14-year-old who'd seen more hardship than most adults, struck Evelyn with fresh force. These children were growing up with a resilience and foresight that formal education could never teach. They understood on a bone-deep level that survival required both addressing immediate needs and planning for a future that might seem impossibly distant. Construction began in earnest as soon as the ground dried enough to dig a proper foundation. Samuel supervised, but increasingly he delegated actual work to Miles and the other older children. Rowan turned out to have a natural talent for masonry. His walls were straight and solid, each stone carefully chosen and placed. Caleb, despite being only 9, could drive nails with remarkable accuracy. Even the youngest children contributed, hauling water and supplies, learning skills that would serve them their entire lives. Lila's education with Doc Pritchard had progressed to the point where she was handling basic cases on her own. When a neighbor's child developed a fever, it was Lila who diagnosed Quincy and prepared the proper treatment. When one of Jensen's farmhands cut his arm badly, Lila cleaned and stitched the wound with steady hands while the man gritted his teeth. "She's got the gift," Doc Pritchard told Evelyn with undisguised pride. "Natural healer's instinct combined with genuine intelligence. In a few more years, she'll be better than I ever was. This territory needs doctors. She could have a real practice, make a good living." "She's 13 years old," Evelyn said, though she felt proud rather than protective, "and already more capable than some physicians I've met with fancy degrees. The frontier doesn't care about age or credentials, it cares about competence. Your girl has it." But it was Grace who brought them their first real income. The 10-year-old had developed her foraging skills to an almost supernatural level, able to find edible and medicinal plants where others saw only weeds. One day she appeared with a basket full of a particular root that Doc Pritchard immediately recognized. "Wild ginseng," he said, examining it with excitement. "Good quality, too. Grace, do you know where there's more of this?" "Yes, sir. A whole patch about 3 miles north, near the creek bend. Wild ginseng sells for premium prices to traders heading to California and China. If you can harvest it sustainably, take some but leave enough to regrow, you could make serious money." Grace looked at Evelyn with barely contained excitement. Can we? They formed a small enterprise. Grace would harvest the ginseng and other valuable plants, Lila would verify they were properly identified and prepare them for sale, and Miles would handle the negotiations with traders. Within 2 months, they'd earned $37 from plant sales alone, enough to pay down their debt to Tibbs and purchase the breeding cattle Clayton Morse had offered. "You've got a head for business," Morse said when Miles negotiated terms for the cattle loan that were more favorable than the rancher's original offer. "Most boys your age would have taken whatever was offered. You haggled like a seasoned trader." "I learned from watching Miss Evelyn," Miles said. "She taught us that respect and fair dealing matter, but so does understanding your own worth. These cattle are an investment in our future. We needed terms that would actually let us succeed, not just survive." Morse laughed, genuinely pleased. "Your father would be proud. Hell, I'm proud, and I barely know you. Keep thinking like that, and Phoenix Ranch will be a major operation in 10 years. The cattle arrived in late May, 6 heifers and a young bull, all healthy stock that would form the foundation of their herd. The children were fascinated and terrified in equal measure. None of them except Miles had significant experience with cattle, and even his knowledge was limited. "They're enormous," Emma whispered, staring at the bull from a safe distance. "And potentially dangerous," Samuel warned. "Everyone needs to learn proper handling. No sudden movements, no running, and never get between a mother cow and her calf. These animals can kill you if you're careless." Jensen and several other ranchers took time to teach them cattle management, how to check for illness, how to supplement feed, how to prepare for calving season. The children absorbed the information with desperate attention, knowing that their future prosperity depended on these animals' survival and reproduction. But livestock brought new challenges. The cattle needed grazing land, which meant fencing. They needed shelter for harsh weather, which meant a barn. They needed water access, which meant improving the creek path and building a proper trough. Each solution created new problems that required resources they barely had. "We're trying to do too much too fast," Evelyn said one night, looking at their accounts. Despite the ginseng income, they were still operating on razor-thin margins. The house construction is using all our labor. The cattle need attention. The garden needs planting. Lila's medical work takes time. We're stretched too thin. So we prioritize, Miles said. He'd started keeping his own set of records, tracking their progress with an organized mind that reminded Evelyn of a seasoned accountant. The house gets finished first. We need proper shelter before next winter. Samuel and I can handle most of that with help from Jensen's crew. The garden is Caleb and Grace's project. They're good at it. Lila continues her medical training because that brings in money and goodwill. Rowan and I will manage the cattle with advice from neighbors. The twins and Thomas help wherever they're needed. And me? Evelyn asked. You're managing everything and everyone, handling the business side, dealing with traders and officials, and teaching the younger children their letters and numbers. You're already doing 3 people's worth of work. It was true, though Evelyn hated admitting how exhausted she felt. Every day brought 100 decisions, 1,000 small crises. But looking around at what they'd built, at children who'd been starving and terrified now thriving with purpose and possibility, the exhaustion seemed worthwhile. The house walls went up through June, and Evelyn watched with something approaching awe as structure emerged from chaos. Samuel had designed it cleverly. The ground floor was 2 rooms, a main living area with the kitchen and a private bedroom for Evelyn. The loft above would sleep all 8 children until they could afford to expand. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and weatherproof and had real glass windows that let in light without letting in wind. It's beautiful, Lila breathed when they finally moved their belongings from the root cellar to the finished house. I never thought we'd have a real home again. This is just the beginning, Evelyn said. Someday, when you're grown, you'll each have your own homes. But this is where we built the foundation, not just of a house, but of a family. They held a small ceremony that evening, gathering around the new stone fireplace. Each person contributed something to a time capsule they'd bury in the foundation. Miles added a sketch of the house plans. Lila included notes from her medical studies. Grace put in a pressed flower from her ginseng patch. The younger children added drawings and small treasures. Evelyn included the letter Thomas Hart had sent her, the one that had brought her to this territory in the first place. We're dedicating this house, Evelyn said formally, to the memory of Thomas and Mary Hart, who dreamed of building something lasting in this territory. They didn't live to see that dream fulfilled, but their children have. This house stands as testimony that tragedy doesn't have to be the end of the story. That from ashes and grief, something beautiful can grow. Samuel added his own contribution to the time capsule. A carpenter's nail, bent and worn. This was the first nail I ever drove, he said quietly. Back when I was an apprentice, younger than Miles is now. I kept it all these years as a reminder of where I started. Now I'm adding it here as a reminder of where I restarted. This family saved my life when I'd given up on living. This house is proof that second chances are real. They buried the capsule at the base of the fireplace and sealed it with mortar. Someday, perhaps generations in the future, someone would discover it and know that Phoenix Ranch was built by people who refused to surrender to despair. The garden came in strong that summer, providing vegetables that improved their diet dramatically. Grace had cultivated not just food crops but medicinal herbs, creating a small pharmacy that Doc Pritchard drew on regularly. Lila dried and preserved plants with labels so precise that the doctor started joking she could publish her own pharmacopoeia. But the real breakthrough came in August when a surveying party passed through, mapping routes for the territorial railroad expansion. The surveyors needed a place to stay, food, and medical attention. One of them had developed an infected wound from a previous mishap. Phoenix Ranch provided all 3. This is exactly what we need, the surveying chief said, examining maps while Lila tended his man's infection. A way station halfway between Redemption Crossing and the territorial capital. Food, shelter, basic medical care. We'd pay well for those services, and so would other travelers once the route is established. How many travelers are we talking about? Evelyn asked. Dozens weekly once the road is improved, possibly hundreds once the railroad comes through. That's years away. But the preliminary routes run close to here. You'd need to expand your facilities, of course. Proper guest quarters, maybe a dining area, but the location is ideal. Evelyn exchanged glances with Miles. They'd been focused on ranching as their primary income, but a way station could provide steady cash flow that didn't depend on weather or market prices. It would mean more work, more construction, more complexity, but it would also mean security. "We'll need to discuss this as a family," Evelyn said. "But yes, we're interested." That night's family meeting was long and passionate. The children had opinions about everything. The older ones understood the business implications. The younger ones were excited about meeting travelers from distant places. They debated, planned, and dreamed until the lamp oil ran low. "I think we should do it," Lila said finally. "We're already managing multiple projects. A way station would tie them together. We'd provide food from our garden, medical care from my training, shelter from structures we're already building. And it would give all of us skills that translate to future opportunities." "It'll be hard work," Miles warned. "Every traveler is another mouth to feed, another person to accommodate, another potential problem." "Everything we've done has been hard," Rowan pointed out. "We're good at hard." The vote was unanimous. Phoenix Ranch would become a way station, serving travelers and building a reputation for quality service and fair dealing. Construction began immediately on guest quarters, a separate building with 4 small rooms that could accommodate 8 travelers comfortably. Samuel designed it to be expandable, with space to add more rooms as demand increased. Jensen's sons did most of the heavy labor in exchange for reduced rates when they needed medical care or accommodations. The blacksmith's wife, who'd been widowed the previous spring, asked if she could work as a cook in exchange for housing. Her name was Margaret, and she brought skills that transformed their basic meals into something travelers would actually pay premium prices for. "You're building an empire," Fletcher observed, watching construction progress during one of his regular visits. He'd become an unofficial advisor, offering insights based on his decades of frontier experience. "Started with nothing but grit and orphans, and now you're running a multifaceted operation." "We're running a survival strategy that happens to look ambitious," Evelyn corrected. "Every piece supports the others. The ranch provides food for the way station. The way station provides income for expansion. The medical practice brings credibility. The children's various skills make it all possible." "That's what an empire is, Miss Hart. Vision plus execution. Your Thomas would be amazed." Evelyn thought about that often. What Thomas Hart would make of what his mail-order bride had built using his children and his land. Would he approve of how she'd taken his dream of a simple ranch and expanded it into something more complex? Would he understand that survival had demanded innovation, that protecting his children had required building something that could sustain them not just for one season, but for a lifetime? She liked to think he would approve. The letters he'd written had spoken of building something lasting, creating opportunity, contributing to the territory's growth. Phoenix Ranch was doing exactly that, just on a larger scale than anyone had anticipated. The first official guests arrived in September, a family heading west, exhausted from weeks of travel. They stayed 3 days while their wagon wheel was repaired by the blacksmith, and during that time they marveled at what they found. "You've built something remarkable here," the father said, paying his bill with obvious reluctance to leave. "Our children actually smiled for the first time in weeks. Your Miss Lila fixed my wife's chronic headache. The food was better than we've eaten since leaving St. Louis. If we weren't committed to Oregon, I'd ask about homesteading nearby." Word spread quickly. Travelers began planning their routes specifically to include a stop at Phoenix Ranch. Some came for the food, others for medical care. Many simply because they'd heard about the mail-order bride and her 8 orphans who'd built something impossible. The ranch became known as a place where hard work was rewarded, where strangers were treated fairly, where the harsh frontier could feel almost civilized. The income from the way station exceeded their projections. By October, they'd paid off their entire debt to Tibbs and had money in reserve for the first time. Evelyn opened an account at the Territorial Bank, depositing funds that felt almost imaginary. Just 2 years ago, she'd had $14 to her name, and now they had nearly $200 saved. "We're actually going to make it," Miles said, reviewing their accounts one evening. He was 15 now, taller and more serious, with the bearing of someone who'd earned his confidence through experience. "Not just survive, actually prosper." "We are," Evelyn agreed, "but we can't get complacent. Bad luck can destroy months of progress. We need to keep building reserves, keep improving, keep planning ahead." Always thinking 3 moves ahead, Miles said with a slight smile. You taught us that. Christmas that year was different from the previous one they'd spent huddled in a root cellar, rationing food and wondering if they'd survive winter. This year, they had a real house, warm and secure. They had enough food to actually celebrate rather than simply endure. They had travelers staying at the way station who shared stories from distant places. They had a future that seemed possible rather than desperately unlikely. Evelyn gave each child a small gift, practical items like good knives, quality boots, books, but also something personal that recognized their individual growth. For Miles, a surveying compass, acknowledging his skills in planning and navigation. For Lila, a proper medical bag with instruments Doc Pritchard had helped her select. For Grace, a leather-bound journal for recording her plant discoveries. Each gift was chosen to say, I see who you're becoming, and I'm proud. The children had pooled their money to buy Evelyn a gift in return, a beautiful shawl woven by a traveling craftsman, dyed in rich colors that reminded her of autumn prairie grass. But more valuable than the shawl was the card they'd all signed with a message written in Miles's careful hand. To Miss Evelyn, who showed us that family isn't just blood. It's choice, courage, and commitment. Thank you for choosing us. Evelyn read those words and wept, overcome by how far they'd all come. From strangers meeting in a collapsed root cellar to a family that chose each other daily. From poverty and desperation to security and possibility. From trauma and grief to healing and hope. I didn't save you, Evelyn said, looking at each child through her tears. We saved each other. Every one of you contributed to our survival. Every one of you made this possible. I'm honored to be your family. The winter that followed was mild by Dakota standards, and Phoenix Ranch weathered it with relative ease. They had plenty of fuel, ample food, secure shelter, and most importantly, the confidence of people who'd survived worse. When spring arrived, bringing with it new travelers and new opportunities, they were ready to build further. Doc Pritchard announced his semi-retirement, officially naming Lila as his successor. At 14, she became one of the youngest practicing medical professionals in the territory, though she refused to call herself a doctor without proper credentials. I'm a healer, she said firmly, learning from experience and study. Maybe someday I'll have official certification, but for now, I know what I know, and that's enough to help people. Her reputation grew quickly. Travelers came specifically for her care, spreading word of the young healer at Phoenix Ranch who combined book learning with practical wisdom. She treated everything from minor injuries to difficult pregnancies, always knowing when to handle cases herself and when to seek advice from other physicians passing through. The way station expanded to 10 rooms that spring, with Samuel and Miles designing efficient layouts that maximize space without sacrificing comfort. Margaret, the cook, took on an apprentice, a young woman from town whose family had fallen on hard times. The ranch now employed 4 people beyond the family itself, providing jobs in a territory where opportunity was scarce. Clayton Morse became a regular visitor, discussing ranching strategies with Miles and occasionally sharing meals with the family. His wife had died years earlier, and he'd become something of a lonely figure despite his success. Evelyn suspected he was drawn to Phoenix Ranch not just for business reasons, but because it represented the family and community he'd lost. You've done something special here, he told Evelyn one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch while children's laughter drifted from inside. Built something that matters. This ranch is becoming the heart of this whole region, economically, socially, even morally. People look to you as an example of what's possible. I just did what needed doing, Evelyn said. That's leadership, Miss Hart, seeing what needs doing and doing it, regardless of how impossible it seems. The frontier needs more of that. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I wonder if you've considered expanding your influence beyond just the ranch. What do you mean? There's talk of incorporation, turning Redemption Crossing into an official town with a charter, elected officials, the whole structure. They're going to need people with vision and competence. You should run for town council. Evelyn laughed, startled. I'm a mail-order bride who's only been here 2 years. You're a business owner who built a successful operation from nothing, who contributed to regional security, who employs local people and serves the community. Your perspective matters, probably more than some rancher who's been here 20 years but never looked beyond his own fence line.
The idea was absurd and intriguing in equal measure. Evelyn had never imagined herself in civic leadership, had never thought her voice would carry weight in official matters.
But looking at what she'd built at Phoenix Ranch, at the children she'd raised and the opportunities she'd created, maybe it wasn't so absurd after all. "I'll think about it," she said. That night, she shared Morse's suggestion with the family during their evening meeting. The responses ranged from excitement to concern, but Miles summarized the consensus best. "You taught us to think bigger than just survival. This is you following your own advice. If you run, we'll support you completely." Spring turned to summer, and Phoenix Ranch continued to grow. Their cattle herd had doubled through successful breeding. The garden had expanded to include cash crops they sold to travelers and local merchants. The way station was booked solid most nights. Lila's medical practice was thriving. Grace's plant harvest had become so profitable they'd hired a local boy to help with collection and processing. They'd built something impossible, a family from strangers, prosperity from ashes, hope from tragedy. And the story wasn't finished. It was still being written, day by day, choice by choice, with courage and determination and love. Evelyn stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over prairie grass that rippled like golden waves. She thought about the terrified woman who'd stepped off a train 2 years ago expecting to meet a husband, finding instead a burned homestead and 8 starving children. That woman couldn't have imagined building what now stretched before her: structures, livestock, thriving children, community respect, genuine prosperity. But she'd done it. They'd done it. Together, they'd transformed tragedy into triumph, built an empire from nothing, created something that would last long after they were gone. Phoenix Ranch had risen from the ashes, and it was still rising. 5 years can transform a landscape, but it can utterly remake lives. By the spring of 1888, Phoenix Ranch had become something beyond what even Evelyn's most optimistic dreams could have conjured. What had begun as a desperate gamble in a collapsed root cellar had evolved into a sprawling operation that served as the economic and social hub for 50 miles in every direction. The ranch itself now encompassed not just the original homestead, but 3 adjacent properties they'd purchased as neighboring families moved on or sold out. The cattle herd numbered over 200 head, making them one of the larger operations in the territory. The way station had grown to accommodate 30 guests, with a proper dining hall where Margaret's cooking had become legendary among travelers. A small general store operated out of one building, selling supplies to passing wagon trains and local homesteaders. And Lila's medical practice had its own dedicated building, equipped with examining rooms and a small pharmacy that served patients from 3 counties. But the physical expansion, impressive as it was, paled compared to the human transformation. The 8 starving children Evelyn had found were now young adults and capable teenagers, each carving their own path while remaining deeply connected to the family they'd built together. Miles, at 19, had grown into a man who commanded respect without demanding it. He managed the ranch operations with a combination of his father's practical wisdom and skills he'd learned from every mentor who'd passed through Phoenix Ranch. He'd officially filed his own adjacent homestead claim the previous year, building a modest house on it with plans to marry Clara Jensen, the daughter of their first neighbor benefactor, come autumn. But he still spent most days at Phoenix Ranch, working alongside his siblings, because some bonds transcended property lines and legal documents. "I've been thinking about water rights," Miles said one morning, spreading maps across the dining table where the family gathered for important discussions. "The creek that runs through our property continues south through 4 other homesteads. If we form a water cooperative, share the maintenance costs and usage rights, we could irrigate more land and attract more settlement. More neighbors means more security, more market opportunities, more everything." Evelyn studied the maps with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 5 years learning ranching, business, and territorial politics. She'd been elected to the town council 2 years earlier, and the position had taught her how interconnected frontier communities truly were. "You're talking about organizing something unprecedented in this region. Most ranchers guard their water rights jealously." "Most ranchers think short-term," Miles countered. "But Pa taught me to think about what builds lasting value. A cooperative benefits everyone if it's structured fairly. And if anyone can convince skeptical ranchers to work together, it's you and Clayton Morse." Clayton had indeed become one of their closest allies, and surprisingly, something approaching family. The lonely widower had found in Phoenix Ranch the community he'd been missing, and his support had been instrumental in their expansion. He and Evelyn had developed a partnership that some townspeople speculated might become romantic, though both of them firmly maintained it was purely practical. Still, Evelyn caught him sometimes watching her with an expression that suggested his feelings might be more complicated than he admitted, even to himself. Lila entered the room carrying her medical bag, preparing for her morning rounds. At 18, she'd become one of the most respected healers in the territory, sought out for cases other physicians wouldn't touch. She'd learned from Doc Pritchard until his death the previous winter, then continued expanding her knowledge through correspondence with physicians in Chicago and even as far as Boston. She'd recently accepted an apprentice of her own, a young man from town whose family had initially objected to being taught by a woman, then changed their minds after Lila successfully treated his mother's dangerous infection. "Before you start planning water cooperatives," Lila said, setting down her bag to pour coffee, "we need to discuss the scarlet fever outbreak in town. 5 confirmed cases, 3 more suspected. I need to quarantine the patients, but the church building isn't suitable for medical isolation. We might need to convert the old bunkhouse here at the ranch." "We're still using that for overflow guest housing," Evelyn said, her mind already calculating the financial impact of losing that income against the moral imperative of helping sick neighbors. "I know, but people are going to die if we don't act. And you taught us that some things matter more than profit margins." There was a time when such a decision would have been agonizing, when losing even a few days of income could have meant disaster. But Phoenix Ranch was no longer operating on survival margins. They had reserves, diversified income streams, and the security to make choices based on values rather than desperation. "Convert the bunkhouse," Evelyn decided. "Margaret, we'll need to arrange meals for quarantined patients. Miles, talk to Samuel about modifications needed for medical isolation. Lila, what else do you need?" "Volunteers willing to risk exposure, supplies, linens, medicines, cleaning materials. And prayers, probably." Grace spoke up from where she'd been quietly working on plant samples at the side table. At 15, she'd become the territory's foremost expert on medicinal plants, with buyers from pharmaceutical companies as far as St. Louis seeking her precisely documented specimens. "I have elderberry syrup and echinacea preparations that might help. Not cures, but they support recovery. And I can harvest more if needed." This was how Phoenix Ranch functioned now. Each crisis met with immediate, coordinated response from people who'd learned to trust each other's competence completely. The youngest children, who'd once clung to Evelyn in terror, were now capable young people contributing meaningfully to both family and community. Rowan, at 13, had developed his masonry skills into something approaching artistry. He designed and built the stone foundation for Lila's medical building, and other homesteaders had started requesting his services for their own construction projects. Caleb, nearly 12, managed their expanded chicken operation and had started experimenting with breeding programs that produced better egg layers. The twins, Emma and Eliza, now 11, ran the ranch's small school. They'd learned their letters from Evelyn and now taught children from neighboring homesteads, earning both income and community goodwill. Even young Thomas, at 8, had responsibilities tending the garden and helping Margaret in the kitchen. Samuel Reed, who'd arrived as a broken drunk seeking purpose, had become the ranch's master builder and an unofficial grandfather to all the children. His constructions had built not just Phoenix Ranch, but half the new buildings in Redemption Crossing. He'd been sober for 5 years, finding in work and family what whiskey could never provide. He sat now in his usual chair by the fireplace, whittling a toy horse for a guest child, listening to the family's discussion with the contentment of a man who'd found his place. The scarlet fever outbreak consumed the next 3 weeks. Lila worked 18-hour days, barely sleeping, treating patients with a combination of medical knowledge and sheer determination. Grace's herbal preparations proved remarkably effective at supporting recovery. Margaret cooked nourishing meals for the sick, and the older children took turns helping with patient care despite the infection risk. They lost 2 patients, an elderly man whose immune system couldn't fight the disease, and an infant whose parents brought her too late for treatment to matter. Lila wept after each death, taking their losses personally despite knowing she'd done everything possible. You can't save everyone, Evelyn told her, holding her daughter, for that's what Lila had become, daughter in every way that mattered, while she grieved. But you saved 5 others who would have died without your intervention. That's not failure, sweetheart. That's heroism. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels like I should have done more, known more, been better. That's what makes you a good healer. The day you stop questioning yourself is the day you should quit medicine. But questioning yourself is different from condemning yourself. You're 18 years old and you've already saved more lives than most physicians save in entire careers. The outbreak eventually subsided and the community's gratitude manifested in unexpected ways. A wealthy rancher whose grandson Lila had saved donated $50 to establish a medical fund for indigent patients. The church organized a benefit dinner that raised enough money to purchase proper medical equipment, a microscope, surgical instruments, diagnostic tools that Lila had only dreamed of owning. The territorial newspaper ran a story about the young healer of Phoenix Ranch, bringing attention that resulted in several families relocating to the area specifically because of the medical care available. But with growth came complications. The increased population meant more demand for water, grazing land, and resources. Tensions developed between established ranchers and newcomers. Some homesteaders struggled, their failures creating opportunities for land speculation that threatened to consolidate property in the hands of wealthy individuals. The frontier that had once seemed endless was filling up, and not all of that growth was healthy. Miles's water cooperative proposal became more relevant and more controversial. Clayton Morse supported it, recognizing that controlled cooperative growth was better than chaotic competition. But other ranchers, particularly those who'd accumulated significant holdings, opposed any arrangement that limited their ability to control resources. They're afraid of us, Miles told Evelyn after a particularly contentious town meeting. Afraid that Phoenix Ranch represents a different way of doing things, cooperative instead of competitive, community-focused instead of individual-focused. We're proving you don't have to crush others to succeed, and that threatens people whose entire philosophy is based on dominance. So how do we convince them? We don't. We build something so successful they can't ignore it, and we invite them to join when they're ready. Some will come around, others won't, but we move forward regardless. The water cooperative formed with 7 participating homesteads, including Phoenix Ranch and Morse's operation. They established fair usage rules, shared maintenance responsibilities, and created a fund for infrastructure improvements. Within a year, the participating properties showed measurably better crop yields and livestock health. Other ranchers began inquiring about joining, the success speaking louder than any argument could have. This became the pattern. Phoenix Ranch would innovate, others would resist, the innovation would prove valuable, and eventually even skeptics would participate. They established the territory's first agricultural lending circle, allowing homesteaders to borrow seed money at fair interest rates. They organized a cooperative marketing system that got better prices for everyone's cattle. They even started a traveling school program, with Emma and Eliza riding circuit to teach children on isolated homesteads. Each initiative built on the principles Evelyn had established from the beginning: cooperation, fairness, community investment, and long-term thinking. And each success proved that these principles weren't just idealistic fantasies, but practical strategies for building sustainable prosperity. By 1889, Redemption Crossing had grown enough to petition for incorporation as an official town. The charter required elected officials, and Evelyn found herself nominated for mayor. She'd been content serving on the council, but the community clearly wanted her in the leadership role. "I'm not sure I'm qualified," she told Clayton during one of their regular strategy discussions. "I've been in this territory barely 6 years. You built one of the most successful operations in 3 counties from literally nothing. You've mentored dozens of homesteaders. You've established systems that benefit entire communities. You're more qualified than anyone else being considered. The question isn't whether you can do the job, it's whether you're willing to." Evelyn looked around Phoenix Ranch, at the buildings they'd constructed, the lives they'd built, the future they'd created. She thought about the terrified mail-order bride who'd arrived expecting a husband and found 8 starving children instead. That woman had chosen courage over retreat, chosen these children over safety, chosen to build rather than abandon. That woman had changed everything, not just for 8 orphans, but for an entire region. Her choices had rippled outward, inspiring others, creating opportunities, establishing precedents. The question Clayton was really asking was whether she was willing to expand that influence even further. If I run, I want Miles as my deputy mayor, and I want the council to include at least 2 women and representation from newer homesteaders, not just established ranchers. Clayton smiled. Now, that's the Evelyn Hart I know. Never just accepts an opportunity. Always makes it better. The election was spirited but not particularly close. Evelyn won with nearly 60% of the vote, becoming one of the first female mayors in the Dakota Territory. Her inaugural address focused on the themes that had defined Phoenix Ranch: cooperation, sustainable growth, opportunity for all, and the belief that a community's strength came from lifting everyone up rather than sorting people into winners and losers. 6 years ago, she said to the assembled townspeople, I arrived here with nothing but determination and $14. I found 8 children who'd lost everything. Together, we built something that seemed impossible. But it wasn't just us. It was neighbors who donated supplies, mentors who shared knowledge, community members who invested in our success. Phoenix Ranch didn't succeed because we were special. It succeeded because we recognized that we needed each other, and we acted on that recognition. That's the philosophy I bring to this office, that all of us together can accomplish what none of us could achieve alone. The children, her children, she thought of them now without qualification, stood in the front row, pride evident on every face. Miles, who'd become her right hand in both ranch and political matters. Lila, whose medical practice was saving lives daily. Grace, whose botanical expertise was bringing in revenue and reputation. Rowan, Caleb, Emma, Eliza, and young Thomas, each pursuing their own paths while remaining part of the family that had saved them all. Samuel stood with them, tears in his weathered eyes. The broken drunk transformed into a master craftsman and beloved grandfather figure. Margaret was there too, the widowed cook who'd become family, her contributions to their success immeasurable. And Clayton Moore stood slightly apart, watching with an expression that mixed pride, affection, and something deeper he'd never quite voiced. He caught Evelyn's eye and nodded, a gesture of respect between equals who'd built something meaningful together. After the ceremony, as people celebrated with food and music, Evelyn found a quiet moment on the edge of the gathering. She looked out over the town that had grown around Phoenix Ranch, at the buildings and businesses and homes that represented hundreds of lives intersecting and supporting each other. She thought about the trail that had led here, from Boston poverty to mail-order bride to accidental mother to rancher to mayor. Each impossible step had led to the next. Each crisis had built capabilities she'd needed for the next challenge. Thinking deep thoughts? Miles asked, joining her. At 20 now, he stood taller than her, solid and capable, but his voice still carried the echo of the 14-year-old boy who'd first challenged her in that ruined cellar. Just reflecting on how strange life is. I came here planning to marry your father, expecting a simple ranch life. Instead, I got you and your siblings, a complex business operation, and now political office. Nothing turned out as planned. Would you change it if you could? Evelyn considered the question seriously. Would she choose the security of the marriage she'd expected over the chaos and challenge of what she'd actually experienced? Would she trade the terror and exhaustion and constant struggle for something easier? No, she said finally, not a single thing. Every hardship taught us something. Every crisis made us stronger. Every impossible situation proved to be possible after all. I wouldn't change any of it. Pa would be proud of you, of all of us, but especially you. Miles's voice caught slightly. Sometimes I barely remember him. I was so young, and so much has happened, but I remember him saying that the measure of a person wasn't what they inherited, but what they built. You built something extraordinary, Miss Evelyn. You took 8 broken children and a burned homestead and created a legacy. We built it together. I was just stubborn enough to try. Stubborn enough to succeed. There's a difference. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their family, biological and chosen, celebrate this latest milestone. Lila was demonstrating proper bandaging techniques to fascinated children. Grace was explaining plant identification to a group of farmers. The younger children were playing games with other townspeople's kids, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Samuel was telling construction stories to aspiring builders. Margaret was organizing the food distribution with practiced efficiency. This was the legacy Evelyn had built, not just a successful ranch or a political career, but a family that functioned as a model for how people could support each other, a community that proved cooperation worked better than competition, a demonstration that tragedy didn't have to define your future. The years continued to unfold, each bringing its own challenges and triumphs. The railroad finally reached the territory in 1891, and Phoenix Ranch's way station became an official stop, bringing even more business. Miles married Clara Jensen in a ceremony that brought together homesteaders from 5 counties. Lila was formally certified as a physician after examination by a board of territorial doctors, making her one of the youngest and first female certified physicians in Dakota. Grace published the region's first comprehensive guide to medicinal plants, a book that would be used by healers for generations. The younger children grew into their own remarkable paths. Rowan established a successful construction company. Caleb developed his poultry operation into a regional supplier. Emma and Eliza opened a proper school in town, expanding beyond basic literacy to offer comprehensive education. Thomas, showing an aptitude for numbers, began training as an accountant, managing finances not just for Phoenix Ranch, but for other businesses. Samuel lived to see all this growth, passing peacefully in his sleep at age 67, surrounded by the family he'd helped build. They buried him on Phoenix Ranch land, in a spot overlooking the valley where he'd done his finest work. Clayton Morse finally admitted his feelings to Evelyn in 1892, proposing marriage with awkward sincerity. She'd grown fond of him over the years, respected him deeply, and appreciated his companionship. But marriage felt like something belonging to a different version of herself, the mail-order bride who'd expected traditional domestic life. She'd built something different, something that didn't fit conventional categories. "I love you," she told him honestly. "But as a dear friend and partner, I don't need a husband to complete my life, Clayton. I need friends, family, purpose, and work that matters. You've been part of all that. Isn't that more valuable than trying to force our relationship into a traditional shape that doesn't quite fit?" He accepted her answer with grace, and their friendship continued, deeper for the honesty between them. Some relationships, Evelyn had learned, didn't need legal or romantic definition to be meaningful. By 1895, 12 years after her arrival, Phoenix Ranch had become the stuff of regional legend. People told stories about the mail-order bride and 8 orphans who'd built an empire from ashes, though the details often grew fantastical in the retelling. But the core truth remained. A woman with nothing but determination and a group of children with nothing but each other had created something remarkable. Evelyn stood on the porch of the main house one summer evening, watching the sun set over land she'd fought to claim and keep. She was 40 years old, no longer the terrified young woman who'd stepped off that train. Her hands were calloused from work, her face weathered by prairie sun, her hair showing streaks of gray. But she stood with the confidence of someone who'd earned every victory and learned from every failure. The 8 children she'd found starving in a collapsed root cellar were now accomplished adults, each carrying forward the lessons they'd learned together. They'd built businesses, raised families, served their communities, and most importantly, they'd paid forward the kindness they'd received. When new homesteaders arrived desperate and struggling, Phoenix Ranch offered the same support Evelyn had once received: supplies on credit, mentorship, community. "You changed the world," Miles told her during a visit, his own children playing in the yard where he'd once worked alongside Samuel to build their first cabin. "Not just our world, but hundreds of people's worlds. Every family we've helped, every system we've established, every precedent we've set, it ripples outward. That's immortality, Miss Evelyn. Not living forever, but creating things that outlast you." Evelyn thought about legacy often now. What would remain after she was gone? Phoenix Ranch would continue. Miles and his siblings would ensure that. The systems they'd established would persist. The precedents they'd set would influence future generations. But beyond the practical legacy, there was something more important. She'd proven that one person's choice to show courage instead of retreating could change everything. That tragedy didn't have to be the end of anyone's story. That family could be built from choice and commitment rather than just blood. That impossible situations sometimes just required impossible levels of determination. The historical record would note that Evelyn Hart served 3 terms as mayor of Redemption Crossing, established successful business operations, and helped develop territorial systems that supported homesteader success. Future historians would study Phoenix Ranch as a model of frontier cooperation and sustainable growth. But Evelyn knew the real story was simpler and more profound. She'd found 8 children who needed her, and she'd needed them just as much. Together, they'd refused to accept that their circumstances defined their possibilities. They'd built a family, a home, a legacy, not because they were special or uniquely talented, but because they'd chosen courage daily, even when courage seemed impossible. On her 50th birthday, the town threw a celebration honoring her contributions. Speeches were made, awards presented, stories told. But the moment that mattered most came quietly, when all 8 of her children, no longer children but adults with their own families and achievements, gathered around her. "We want to establish something," Lila said, speaking for all of them. "A foundation in your name, to help desperate people the way you helped us, to prove that your example of courage and compassion can be repeated, can be taught, can change other lives the way you changed ours." The Hart Foundation would eventually help hundreds of orphans, provide medical care to thousands, and establish educational opportunities across the territory. But on that evening, what mattered was the love evident in 8 pairs of eyes looking at the woman who'd chosen them when everyone else had turned away. "I didn't save you," Evelyn said, repeating words she'd spoken years earlier. "We saved each other. Everything we built together. That's what I hope people remember. Not that one woman did something remarkable, but that people working together can overcome anything." As the celebration continued around her, Evelyn felt a deep peace settle over her spirit. She'd come to Dakota Territory expecting one future and found something entirely different, harder, messier, infinitely more complex, but also more meaningful than anything she could have planned. She'd arrived with nothing and built everything that mattered. Not wealth, though they'd achieved security. Not fame, though their story was known throughout the territory. But family, community, purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that she'd made the right choice that day in the collapsed cellar. The sun set over Phoenix Ranch, painting the prairie gold and amber, the same colors as the day Evelyn had first arrived. But the land that had once seemed barren and hostile now teemed with life. Cattle grazing, crops growing, children playing, families building futures. From ashes, a phoenix had risen. Not just a ranch, but a testament to what courage, compassion, and commitment could create. And that legacy would endure long after every person present had turned to dust, inspiring others to believe that impossible situations sometimes just required impossible determination to overcome. Evelyn Hart had come west expecting to be a mail-order bride. Instead, she'd become a mother, a rancher, a leader, and a legend. She'd proven that tragedy didn't have to define a life story, that sometimes, with enough courage, you could write a completely different ending. And that ending, built from ashes and determination and love, had become a beginning for countless others who'd find their own courage in her example, their own strength in her story, their own hope in the knowledge that one person choosing compassion over retreat could change the world. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also a place where new stories could be written, where the past didn't have to determine the future, where a woman with $14 and 8 orphan children could build an empire that would outlast them all. Phoenix Ranch stood as proof that some legacies aren't inherited. They're forged in fire, built from nothing, and sustained by the daily choice to believe in better possibilities. And that legacy, Evelyn knew as she stood surrounded by family and community she'd helped create, was the only immortality that truly mattered.